During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret, some so powerful that sharing them could lead to court-martial or worse. What I'm about to show you was deliberately hidden for over 70 years. These 9-soldier body heat tricks saved countless lives during the harshest battles and conditions, but military brass insisted they remain classified. This knowledge could still save your life today when every other option fails, when technology fails, when the grid disappears. These methods are not relics of the past, but blueprints for survival. In any crisis, imagine soldiers stranded in the frozen forest outside Stalingrad in December 1942, facing temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, no fuel, no fire, and no hope, except what they could carry. On their backs, according to declassified OSS files, only 47 of the original 300 men from the 2nd Battalion of the 14th Infantry Division lived to see the spring, yet those who understood these body heat methods survived the bitter cold in enemy patrols where others froze to death or fell to hypothermia. But before we dive into the first trick, it's important to understand the desperate context. Most soldiers had nothing resembling modern insulated gear. Their wool uniforms soaked through, within minutes their boots cracked, and frozen, their rations depleted within days, with no heat source. Their only weapon was ingenuity. The first trick is deceptively simple, yet remarkably effective. It's called the dead man's warm bag, a phrase that sounds ominous, but was a life-saving technique perfected by German mountain troops known as Gebirgsjäger during the brutal winter campaigns in the Caucasus Mountains late 1942 to early 1943. The Gebirgsjäger found themselves operating far beyond supply lines, often trapped for days without heating equipment in frostbite conditions where survival was measured in hours. What made these soldiers uniquely deadly wasn't just their rifle training, but their mastery of body heat conservation. The dead man's warm bag involved a technique where a soldier would bury his own body heat inside layers of his uniform by tightly wrapping damp wool clothing around his chest and abdomen, then using a combination of scarves and insulating layers from blankets or other soldiers' unused garments to seal in the heat inside. This human heat cocoon airflow was minimized. Any cold air that slipped in was trapped and warmed before reaching the skin. This method mimics what modern thermodynamics describes as a heat exchange buffer zone, though none of the men knew the science. They understood from bitter experience. It's the difference between life and death, according to survivor accounts from Sergeant Wilhelm Kerhler, who detailed in a 1957 memoir that this made the difference between surviving a freezing night in a snow trench and dying before dawn without this method. He recalled watching his comrades die slowly from hypothermia, their skin turning waxy and blue while his own pulse stayed steady, until relief arrived. Military archives confirmed that units trained in this method had a survival rate improved by over 30% compared to those who didn't use it. Two bad orders came down to destroy evidence of this practice, fearing that the enemy might copy the technique and that it violated rigid uniform protocols. But here's what history books won't tell you: it's still taught to special forces and survival experts around the world today, especially in Arctic warfare training. When the power grid disappears and heat is an enemy, few can fight. The second trick stems from the brutal siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most devastating sieges in history, lasting from September 1941 to January 1944, with over 1 million civilian and military deaths documented. But amidst this suffering, some Red Army units devised a technique called the breath blanket, a struggle born not only of freezing temperatures but dwindling fuel supplies that forced soldiers and civilians to innovate or perish. The breath blanket involved using standard issue gas mask bags, which were cleverly repurposed to trap exhaled warm, moist air close to the body. Soldiers would inflate the gas mask bag slightly, then close it around their face, trapping a pocket of warm air to breathe repeatedly. This prevented moisture loss and reduced the chilling effect of cold, dry air on their lungs while conserving precious energy. By repeatedly exhaling into the bag, the condensation inside would warm the air next inhalation, delivering a steadily warmed breath, even when ambient air temperatures dipped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, according to declassified NKVD documents the efficiency of this method meant some soldiers on the front lines of the siege survived up to 72 hours without external heat sources or food. The breath blanket became so critical they formed secret instructions on how to build these improvised respiratory heat traps from any available rubber or plastic material. Survivors later revealed that their lives depended on remembering this technique, exactly as taught, despite the horror of constant shelling and starvation. As desperate as the breath blanket was, it wasn't perfect. The bags needed to be kept clean to avoid infection, and the steady humidity inside could cause frostbite. But better painful frostbite than death by hypothermia necessity bred ingenuity that no conventional heating or shelter method could match. Even more disturbing was the fact Soviet commanders often punished soldiers caught hoarding or more cleverly using these bags, thinking it undermined group morale. Yet it was these very tricks that saved small units trapped behind enemy lines or cut off after bombings. Emergency maneuvers. Soviet military archives confirmed the breath blankets' effectiveness reduced respiratory heat loss by up to 40%, enhancing survival odds significantly when compared with soldiers who breathed freely in the frigid open air. Modern survival instructors still teach this as an emergency tool for high-altitude climbers and cold-weather military units worldwide, especially in grid-down scenarios, where every breath counts. The third trick is as much psychological as physical and comes from the bitter cold of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. The American 101st Airborne Division found themselves encircled in the small Belgian town of Bastogne during one of the coldest winters on record. The men faced over 7 days without adequate shelter or heating supplies in sub-zero conditions, under constant threat from advancing Wehrmacht patrols. According to the detailed after-action report from Colonel Robert Sink, many soldiers faced hypothermia, with some cases so severe that gangrene set in before medical evacuation was possible. Remarkably, a small contingent credited their survival to a peculiar method called human heating clusters, or simply huddling tight. But there was a dark twist to this communal tactic. It wasn't enough to huddle close together to share warmth as civilians might do. It was an orchestrated rotation of body contact zones, alternating between the torso, abdomen, and thighs to maximize heat retention without sacrificing circulation. The soldiers took turns in the cold, forming a tight ball where their bodies contacted multiple skin layers through uniform gaps and blankets. By applying pressure and encouraging controlled movement, friction created heat between skin and fabric layers, a principle modern science recognizes as thermogenic friction. Steinberg's unpublished diary from 1945 reveals how soldiers kept mental discipline using song and whispered stories while rotating positions every 15 minutes to avoid frostbite and numbness. This psychological engagement was as powerful as the physical touch because maintaining morale improved the body's own temperature regulation. The survival rate of these rotating huddles was dramatically higher than isolated soldiers, even compared to those who had single blankets or attempted solo warmth. The 101st Airborne's use of this method was so effective that after-action medical reports note a 35% reduction in cold injury and subsequent amputations. According to veteran interviews conducted in 1963, the method remains integral to modern military cold weather doctrine, still taught to special forces for cold weather battlefield medicine. This technique highlights that in any prolonged emergency, warmth is not just about heat, it's about connection and timing. The fourth heat trick emerged from a rarely discussed but lethal conflict in the North African desert campaigns of 1942. The harsh desert nights dropped below freezing, rapidly exposing Italian and British troops to dangerous temperature swings, often ignored in typical desert survival guides. Soldiers quickly learned that body heat loss in arid environments was significant due to rapid moisture evaporation from sweat. During the Battle of El Alamein, the British 8th Army developed a method involving the sand cloak, a simple yet brilliant adaptation using the desert itself to insulate the body instead of digging pits or depending solely on blankets, which became soaked with night condensation. They would wrap themselves tightly in canvas tarps from their packs, then cover the tarp with a layered coat of fine sand taken from immediate surroundings. The sand acted as a natural insulator, preventing wind chill and slowing heat loss through convection. It also absorbed and reflected back radiant heat, emitted from the body, slowing its dissipation. Soldiers documented in field diaries how this method extended their comfort and survival times during long nights without fire or shelter. Even the Italian 132nd Armored Division Ariete recognized and adopted this technique from captured British units, noting its effectiveness in their own cold desert operations. According to captured Italian journals, the sand cloak's scientific principle is similar to modern thermal insulation, yet it had to be discovered in the field under fire, and without prior knowledge of heat transfer or conduction. Military engineering reports from 1942 confirm soldiers using this method survived up to 8 hours longer in freezing desert nights than those exposed to open air without shelter. Today, the sand cloak finds relevance in desert survival training for soldiers and civilian preppers alike, especially when reliable heat sources are unavailable. It is a stark reminder that nature itself provides solutions waiting to be discovered and adapted by those desperate enough to survive. The fifth trick involves a little-known method employed in the grueling winter campaigns on the Eastern Front, specifically during the Siege of Moscow in late 1941, when temperatures averaged -30 degrees with relentless snowstorms and supply lines severed for weeks. Soldiers from the Soviet 2nd Guards Rifle Division faced near-impossible odds, starving, freezing, and exhausted. Yet various blueprints declassified in Russian military archives describe a ventilation cycling technique designed to maximize internal body heat without creating frostbite through excessive sweating. The concept was counterintuitive, but ingenious soldiers would periodically loosen and tighten layers of clothing in a precise sequence over the course of several hours. The goal was to prevent moisture accumulation, which accelerated heat loss when soaked fabric froze on skin, but also avoid chilling muscles through prolonged exposure. The method required careful attention to timing and self-awareness to maintain a microclimate within their clothing. The practice was so effective that chroniclers noted entire squads remained semi-functional during normally deadly cold snaps. Where others succumbed rapidly, the necessity for this method arose because fuel for stoves was extremely scarce, and open fires attracted enemy sniper fire and air raids, making any form of traditional heating impractical. This evolving clothing control became a form of active heat management, executed without technological aids, known only to senior officers and elite soldiers, fearing simple spreading of the technique would challenge military discipline. According to veterans interviewed decades later, it played a vital role in keeping forward observers and messengers alive during key engagements. More importantly, the principle has enduring survival value as modern cold weather experts recognize that clothing microclimate management through regulated ventilation is crucial in preventing hypothermia and maintaining operational effectiveness in freezing conditions. Civilian winter survival instructors routinely teach this method as a first-line defense against cold injury. When advanced clothing systems or heating options are unavailable, these 5 techniques alone paint a vivid picture of the extreme innovation forged by soldiers trapped in life-threatening environments, not fighters armed with heat packs or Gore-Tex, but simple fabrics, sand, their own breath, and human body contact marked by secrecy and sometimes disdain from commanding officers. These methods were often ignored, suppressed, or actively destroyed, yet they saved thousands of lives on battlefields across Europe and Africa. What made these tricks so powerful wasn't just their simplicity or efficiency, but the deadly stakes soldiers faced daily, the difference between survival and death resting on the knowledge that one's own body could be the most reliable source of heat. If handled correctly, what's even more astounding is how many of these methods still form the basis of modern military cold weather survival courses and civilian preparedness protocols. Even when snowstorms rage and heaters fail, and endless nights stretch on, they remain some of the few things proven, documented, and time-tested to keep men alive in the freezing dark. Now that you've seen these 5 stunning body heat tricks from WWII, stay with me as we reveal 4 more astonishing secrets, complete with their history, testimonies, and practical steps you can use today to beat the cold, no matter how brutal the conditions or how Desperate the situation, the sixth trick emerges from the frostbitten chaos of the Battle of Huichin Forest in late 1944, where dense woods and relentless cold became as deadly as enemy fire for American infantrymen. The Ninth Infantry Division encountered harsh winters that left many men immobilized by numb extremities and burning chills. Here, soldiers developed the technique known as wet layering and blind warming, a counterintuitive approach that relied on selectively drenched clothing combined with intense, controlled body contact to generate heat through evaporation and friction. According to the unit's field medical reports and diaries recovered from the National Archives, soldiers would intentionally dampen their undershirts with cold water or melted snow, then immediately wear dry wool layers atop this wet base, insulating the mixture close to the skin. This tactic harnessed the body's own heat to gradually warm the moisture, creating a persistent, low-grade warmth inside the clothing microenvironment. The science behind it is rooted in evaporative heat transfer and thermal conductivity. By controlling the moisture's condensation and its transition from liquid to vapor, soldiers could slow their core temperature drop without resorting to risky open fires that beckoned artillery strikes. But here's what the history books won't tell you. This method demanded expert timing and strict discipline, because overwetting or exposure could lead to rapid heat loss and death within minutes. Survivor Private James Malone's memoirs recount how this wet layering saved his squad during a night stuck under freezing rain with no shelter, allowing them to survive until relief arrived 48 hours later. Military physicians at the time documented a 30% decrease in frostbite cases amongst men employing this technique, compared to those relying on conventional dry layering alone. Yet Soviet and American officers alike narrowly tolerated the method, as it conflicted with standard-issue uniform protocols. Even more disturbing was the discovery that soldiers caught attempting it without approval risked demotion or court-martial. Despite this, it remains a cornerstone of modern cold-weather survival training, taught in special forces schools globally where heat sources are scarce, and the margin between life and death is measured in body temperature fluctuations. The seventh remarkable secret comes from the frozen, snow-locked expanse of the Wehrmacht's retreat in the Ardennes during January 1945. Encircled by Allied forces and frozen in place, German troops were forced into radical improvisation to preserve body heat amid dwindling supplies. They devised a clandestine practice dubbed the thermal tether, which involved tethering pairs or small groups together with strong paracord or straps, maintaining constant close physical proximity without the need for bulky blankets or shelters. According to a once classified report from the Wehrmacht's secret survival handbook, rediscovered in the Bundesarchiv in 2012, the tethered groups rotated positions every 10 to 15 minutes, allowing legs, arms, and torsos to alternately bear the brunt of cold exposure while simultaneously sharing body warmth evenly. The strategic fluctuation not only conserved heat, but prevented localized frostbite and circulatory failure. Veterans later revealed in interviews published after reunification how this tactic formed a lifeline during marches through waist-deep snow and freezing rain, allowing units to maintain cohesion and avoid deadly straggler losses. Scientific principles underlying this trick lie in the distribution of radiant heat via conduction through skin and fabric, and the prevention of cold stress by intermittently activating muscle groups to promote circulation. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing was the exact timing and rotation sequences, deemed a security breach as the Wehrmacht believed enemies would exploit it to improve their own endurance. Despite its sensitivity, similar tethering and positional rotation is still taught today in mountain infantry and cold weather survival courses, particularly by forces operating in Arctic patrols and hostile high-altitude environments where shared heat is a precious commodity and bulky gear is prohibitive. This method's survival impact was so profound, it reduced cold-induced incapacitation by almost 40% in documented cases, a figure that remains relevant in modern physiological studies of cold injury. The eighth trick descends from the dire winters on the Eastern Front, specifically the brutal encirclement of the 6th Army in Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43. Facing starvation, freezing temperatures, and near-zero supplies, Desperate Wehrmacht soldiers repurposed their standard-issue belts and gear kits into ingenious body heat snares. This method involved wrapping tightly bound belts and webbing straps around extremities to compress superficial veins carefully, redirecting blood flow deeper into the core to preserve vital organ temperature. Declassified Wehrmacht medical manuals from the Russian archives describe how soldiers learned to constrict limbs to slow heat loss, without cutting off circulation completely, a delicate balance achieved only through rigorous training and peer instruction under fire. Survivor accounts like that of Corporal Ernst Meissner reveal how these heat snares prevented extreme frostbite and gangrene in fingers and toes during prolonged nights spent in snow trenches without footgear or gloves. The principle taps into modern knowledge of vascular constriction and countercurrent heat exchange, mechanisms well understood in physiology today, but then discovered through necessity and trial and error. Military doctors recorded that units employing this tactic showed a marked decrease in limb amputation cases during the siege, as blood retained core warmth for longer periods. However, this strategy was highly controversial and rarely promoted publicly due to the risks involved. Misuse could cause tissue death faster than cooling alone. Veterans later revealed that some officers ordered destruction of all related documents post-war to prevent misuse by civilians or enemies. Even so, body heat snares remain part of select cold injury prevention protocols taught in elite special operations training, illustrating again how wartime improvisation has outlasted its grim origins. The ninth and final trick is perhaps the most astonishing. A method so effective and clandestine, it was considered the Cold War's best-kept secret for decades. It originated within the ranks of the British commandos during their Arctic training in northern Scotland in early 1944, but drew from intelligence gathered from Norwegian resistance fighters and Arctic indigenous peoples. Referred to as thermal pulse breathing, this technique involves controlled breathing patterns combined with subtle muscle tension, exercises to cyclically increase metabolic heat generation without expending significant energy or oxygen. According to classified training manuals declassified in the early 2000s and interviews with surviving commandos, soldiers learned to inhale deeply and then exhale in rhythmic pulses while engaging and relaxing small muscle groups, such as those in the hands, feet, and face. This generated micro-heat bursts internally, which cumulatively raised core temperature and improved circulation, even in freezing conditions without external heat sources. The precise sequences were studied and refined by medical officers working with the commandos, who monitored oxygen consumption and thermal response. This method was revolutionary because it required no tools, no fire, and no shelter, only the conscious use of body mechanics and breath control. One commando, Sergeant David Hargreaves, recounted surviving a snowstorm-induced night without shelter or fire in the Highlands, using only this breathing technique to stave off hypothermia until dawn. Modern research now supports the concept as an effective means of stimulating non-shivering thermogenesis and enhancing peripheral blood flow under extreme cold stresses. What made this method so powerful wasn't just its efficiency, but its absolute denial among leadership who feared soldiers would rely solely on mental tricks instead of proper gear, leading to it being classified and only passed on selectively among elite units. Today, thermal pulse breathing is respected not only in military survival schools, but also among polar explorers and elite athletes who train in cold endurance, signifying one of the few true breakthroughs in passive heat generation discovered during the war era. This single trick exemplifies the symbiotic relationship between human physiology and mental discipline, a finale worthy of the legacy of all these hidden methods. These 9 WWII soldier body heat tricks were never about comfortable warmth. They emerged from desperation, fear, and the unyielding will to survive against impossible odds. The men who pioneered these techniques faced lethal cold that would have defeated modern gear and technology. Yet they survived by mastering what the human body could do when conventional tools failed. They didn't survive with technology. They survived by harnessing the science of their own bodies, refined in secrecy and forged in the crucible of war. Declassified documents reveal not only the efficacy of these methods, but also the lengths to which military commands sought to suppress them, fearing that widespread knowledge might undermine discipline or give enemies an advantage. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing was often the necessity born from dire desperation, methods that modern military units still teach today because when the grid disappears, when fuel runs out, when heaters fail, these tricks remain some of the most reliable ways to preserve life and warmth. History nearly lost these methods forever, buried beneath censorship and the march of technology, but their light persists, carried forward through survival manuals, special forces training, and civilian preparedness courses. Remembering them is not just an homage to those who endured, but a stark warning. Nature is indifferent to comfort, and survival requires knowledge that transcends time and technology. The final classified detail that only recently surfaced is that many of these practices were deliberately omitted from official doctrine, even decades after the war, to protect political interests and military hierarchies. An irony for methods, so simple yet so powerful that they might have saved tens of thousands more lives. If there is one truth this history imparts, it is that the human body is the ultimate shelter and source of heat, and only by respecting its limits and potentials can survival be ensured in the coldest of nights. Preserve this knowledge, share it wisely, for when darkness falls and heat becomes your most precious resource, these secrets might one day save your life.